Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. We're going to meet our guest really soon. First, I want to talk about emotional issues around money. Do you ever feel unease or discomfort around money? Specifically, where and how you're spending money, what your money is invested in, and where to donate if you have the ability to do that. How do you make your money work in alignment with your values? I found a great show that helps me navigate this. It's called Spend, Donate, Invest, and it's hosted by Gennet Gimja. In our episodes, Gennet takes on a financial topic, maybe one that you've wondered about, or maybe one you've never thought about and are glad to have put on your radar. I love this podcast. It really makes me think about how to align my financial life with the kind of world I'd like to live in. You can find Spend, Donate, Invest anywhere you listen to podcasts, and you can learn more about Spend, Donate, Invest at the website spenddonateInvest.world. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. What are some of your favorite simple pleasures? I could come up with a long list. One of my favorite things is meeting up with one of my really good friends at a local coffee shop. We'll sit there for hours talking about everything, what's happening in our lives, what we're working on, sometimes what we want to work on together. I also really love going out in nature, even if it's just to a local park. Just taking a minute to hang out with the birds and the squirrels doing their thing. But if I had to name my favorite simple pleasure, it's this: getting into my own bed at the end of a long day and snuggling in to go to sleep. These are a few of the ordinary, everyday things I love. They're part of life, and I should be able to just live my life. Shouldn't everyone? Can you imagine being in a world where you can't do these simple, everyday things? Well, lots of people can imagine it because they are in that world. If you're a Black American, can you safely just hang out in a coffee shop? Can you walk or gather in a public park? Can you even sleep in your own bed without the fear of harassment, suspicion, or confrontation with law enforcement that turns deadly? In her latest book, illustrator and comic artist Ajuan Mance has compiled a list of everyday things that, when done by Black people, have resulted in these kinds of negative experiences. Living While Black, Portraits of Everyday Resistance is an encyclopedia of sorts with drawings and definitions of many of the things that have resulted in everything from harassment to death at the hands of law enforcement when white people have reacted with fear or annoyance at African Americans and those of African descent who are just living their lives. Ajuan includes a timeline with sources for all of the incidents that inspired her drawings and entries, which honestly makes for some harrowing reading. But if you're looking for illustrations of victims among Ajuan's work, you're not going to find them. As she says so eloquently in her acknowledgments at the end of the book, this book owes a debt of gratitude to Black people everywhere who meet the skepticism and suspicion of others with steadfast refusals to scale back the scope of our lives, our joys, and our love for ourselves and each other. Ajuan's combination of drawings of Black people living the fullness of their lives and the definitions of everyday things that draw the ire of white people might just make you feel sad, enraged, and hopeful. We're about to meet Ajuan Mance. Don't forget to follow Art Heals All Wounds on your favorite listening app. 5-star ratings are always very much appreciated because they help the podcast grow. The more it grows, the more we can keep bringing you the stories behind the work of incredible artists. Ajuan Mance is a professor of African American literature at Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland, California. As a lifelong artist and writer, Ajuan has participated in solo and group exhibitions and comic and zine fest, and she's been a frequent panelist at Comic-Con. In all of her art, Ajuan uses humor and bright colors to explore race, gender, power, and the people and places in which they intersect. Living While Black is Ajuan's second book of illustrations and collected writings. Her first book, 1001 Black Men, Portraits of Masculinity at the Intersections, was published in 2022. These were preceded by 2 other academic books on Black literature by Ajuan called Before Harlem and Inventing Black Women. Hi, Ajuan. Welcome back to Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm Ajuan Mance. I am an English professor. I'm also an instructor of illustration and comics, and I'm an artist, visual art, illustration, and comics as well.
Well, I wanted to have you back on a second time. We talked before about your work in general, about the importance of representation, and I wanted to ask you to come back on to talk about your latest book, Living While Black, Portraits of Everyday Resistance.
It's great to be back again. Thanks for having me.
You know, you and I are friends, and I follow your work fairly closely, and I was anticipating this book coming out, and I thought to myself, oh, it's going to be wonderful. But what I didn't really expect was the emotional impact it was going to have on me. And I wonder if you can just describe a bit what this book is.
Living While Black is an illustrated encyclopedia of just 40-some of the things that are perfectly legal, but for which African Americans have been arrested, harassed, or even killed.
I'm wondering if you can start by reading the first 2 paragraphs of your introduction to this book, because I think it gives a lot of context for why you created this work.
Sure. Yeah, I would be happy to. On a flyer dated April 24th, 1851, unnamed parties cautioned the colored people of Boston to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers and to shun them in every possible manner. So many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. And that's a quote from the flyer. Police and other law enforcement agents had recently been granted the authority to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and events in Boston and elsewhere in the United States made clear that no black person was safe if white men felt empowered to stop, question, and apprehend anyone they suspected of being a fugitive. In the summer of 2020, as Americans crowded the streets to protest the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other black people who lost their lives at the hands of police, I could not help but to think back to the colored people of 1850s Boston. What would they think, not only of the deaths of unarmed black people at the hands of police, but of the persistent harassment of black people by non-blacks whose discomfort with their presence in community settings like libraries, swimming pools, and shopping malls, too often ended in demeaning confrontations and 911 calls. How would they respond to this continuing crisis? As a Black artist living in this moment of reckoning, how would I?
Thank you. Well, one thing I wonder about this book is your own personal relationship to this work. We hear a bit from your reading of the introduction that you felt a call to action. But I'm also wondering about just your everyday relationship to it and your relationship to this topic. What has it been like to do such a large collection of drawings around the violence and harassment that you're outlining in this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I began creating the drawings in the summer of 2020, it was a pleasure. I felt like I could do something. And the drawing itself, bright colors, I knew I wanted people to look vibrant and joyful, the way that Black people look going through our everyday lives. We're just living. We're not living at anyone. It's not an assault. Our presence in the high-end grocery store is not an attack on the other people in the store. But in order to do the drawings, I had to do some research. There were some incidents, very high-profile incidents, of which I was quite aware, especially the incidents in the Bay Area. Barbecuing while Black, selling water while Black, and, several of the other incidents that occurred in the Bay Area. But I had to do some research to continue to build out that list. That started to, it didn't change the process for me because it's a terrible, ridiculous phenomenon in the 2020s that this still happens. But the scope of it, I just pursued, some lists. The root.com has a great list that I don't know if they're continuing to add to it, they could. But at the end of the book, there's a timeline of these events. And that just amplified the feeling I had when I first started doing the research, that I knew this was a phenomenon. I knew it was bad. I've experienced it myself. I haven't been arrested or subject to violence, but I've certainly had people behave in a way that makes it clear that they don't understand why I'm there and that it's suspicious that I'm in this store or driving on this road. But the scope of it was much broader than I thought, and the age range from 5-year-olds all the way up to people who were in their 80s and 90s, sometimes subject to violence. That was really hard to confront every day when I searched newspaper databases just to read case after case after case. It was daunting.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up this timeline. The first part of the book is this collection of drawings, and they are depictions of people who are doing these everyday activities, and it might be driving while Black, sleeping while Black, shopping while Black, being a kid while Black, crying while Black. And you have the drawings, you have like a little definition as if it is a encyclopedia entry talking about what this is. But then the timeline in and of itself is such a devastating read. And I know it's not even comprehensive, but it is incredibly distressing to read it. And I think the importance of including that as opposed to just the drawings and the definitions. And I'm wondering, at what point did you decide to do this timeline? When did that become a part of the book?
I have to say, as I was putting this book together, and it was really wonderful serendipity, I was working on another book with an editor, and the editor looked in my social media and said, hey, this other set of drawings looks like a book. And, I thought, oh, great, a collection of the drawings. But the text in the book kind of evolved over time. Instead of just captions that say, living while Black, I was encouraged to, I was like, well, describe it. And then I thought, well, one of the best ways to describe it would be to write an encyclopedia entry on it, or, almost a dictionary definition of it with pronunciation. And I really kind of got into that. And actually from the beginning, when I was doing the drawings and posting them on Instagram, I thought, someone's going to look at one of the more they're all outrageous, but something like sleeping while Black and say, well, that you're just making that up. And so I thought it was really important to have documentation of every single one of the types of incidents I listed. And so that's where the timeline came from. And I could go all the way back to the 18th century if I wanted to. But I thought, let's start with when people actually started believing Black people when we say this kind of thing happens. And that was Oscar Grant. And when Oscar Grant was killed, it was the first time an extrajudicial murder of a Black person by police officers was captured on and distributed through cell phone video, or I think someone also had a small camera. Several people captured it and then distributed it through the internet. And so I thought that's a real turning point. And it was the first thing that happened on January 1st of that year. And I thought I'll bring that all the way up through when the actual writing of the book was done. And so that was a slog, coming up with all of that evidence. But unfortunately, it wasn't difficult to find several examples of each of these kinds of incidents.
Right. I think that is such an amazing place to start, because I do wonder if that is a turning point for us as a country. And by us, I mean, obviously not only Black people, but all of us who are not Black, to be able to see this evidence of what goes on every day. And it's other people filming. Sometimes it's people filming in self-defense, what's happening to them. And although we know that there are all kinds of ways to manipulate media, what's been fabulous about having these little cameras in our hands all the time is that it's raw, it's real, it's happening. And I don't know if you wonder that as well. Was it a turning point in terms of creating awareness and also just validating for people to have this kind of evidence?
I think it was absolutely a turning point. There has been my entire life, and I know the lives of my parents and grandparents, a huge divide between what African Americans know to be the reality of their lives, that there are very few acts that in the wrong context, on the wrong street, in context with in an encounter with the wrong white person, can turn very ugly very quickly. But there, on the other hand, is a different way of knowing for whom that is not a daily reality. And it's such a horrible thing that people would rather not believe it's true than believe Black people. The undeniable evidence of the cell phone really transformed this. And it's so different today than it was, I think it was the early 80s or 1970s, late 70s, when there was a man who was killed by police in Miami. African-American man, and I wish I had looked up his name, but what I remember most saliently is my mother crying when we were watching a news program about that. And not a lot was done. It wasn't talked about for terribly long. Black people were very upset about it, but there wasn't the groundswell that there was with George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. You know, in the 2020s, it's completely different, because now people believe what Black people have been saying all along. They've seen it, and they've been appalled by the ugly and distorted mirror that it holds up to a society whose ideals don't make space for that kind of harassment. And so I'm very hopeful. I don't watch any of those videos. I've never seen one. I don't want to see someone get shot. I don't want to see someone being dressed down and demoralized. I don't need to see the videos. I believe I believe this happens. But the fact that it's there is important. I discourage people from watching African American people. If you feel like it's important to be a witness, watch the videos. But I can be a witness in my heart without having to subject myself to seeing this horrible thing. It was hard enough to research and read the stories, but I'm so glad they're out there.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think part of the impact of the book for someone like myself who doesn't live in this reality is that just for a few hours, you get the weight of this kind of, I don't know whether to call it vigilance. It's just vigilance of where you are in the world and what the people around you are doing. Because you're absolutely right. Who do you encounter that's going to completely flip a very ordinary situation onto its head? And what worries me reading these stories, and the ones that really penetrate the most deeply, are how children are subjected to this criminalization. I have seen videos of the security officers in schools dealing with children, of police officers being called to a classroom and how they deal with children, arrests of children. And for me, it hit home with Trayvon Martin because I had a 17-year-old at that time. And I just thought, if people do not understand that 17-year-olds are still babies, then I just don't know what. That's the thing that just, I couldn't wrap my head around, how we're talking about a 17-year-old child. And your book brings up things that happen to 5-year-olds that are just shocking. A lot of stories that don't make the major news stories.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things that was really important for me in doing all the research for these different incidents, that bringing to light these incidents that didn't get national coverage. If somebody doesn't die or come close to being killed, it will not generally become a national story. And yet the attacks, broken arms, senior citizens having their arms broken, 5-year-olds sitting in the back of a police car with handcuffs on. I mean, these types of incidents, they're still alive after this happens. But it is traumatizing, not just for the people themselves, but for their entire communities. Because once again, these are acts that are not crimes. And there's no person of African descent, African American, Afro-Caribbean, African immigrants and their children. I mean, all of us who are Black in this country, there's not a Black person in the United States who doesn't do at least several of the acts in this book sometimes. And, in some ways, I think it reflects a reality we all understand, that if all of these things can at some point turn on a dime and lead to an incident that is at the least demoralizing, at worst violent and lethal. I mean, I think that's what I wanted to capture with the drawings, is the heroism of Black people who can walk through the world doing what they want to do, having some joy and pleasure and feeling pride in themselves, even though almost every activity they take place in the wrong place with the wrong person puts them at great risk. Everything, going to the grocery store is an act of resistance. When I walk into a grocery store in Montclair here in Oakland, I'm very cognizant of the fact that people might not really welcome my presence, because this is not necessarily why you move to certain areas to shop with Black people all the time, or, Black people are unexpected in certain places. And if you're unexpected, then people get scared and you seem like you're 6 feet tall and you're going to strangle them. The perceptions of African Americans are they outstrip our power. In people's minds, we're superheroes who are almost impervious to pain and who can knock a white person down with a single sweep of our hand. We are perceived as not people in the same way. And there's been a lot of research to indicate that. It's one of the things that makes life so unsafe for us.
I don't want to at all take away from the power of the pride, the joy, all the things you're talking about in your drawings. What is really powerful is that the timeline does talk about the actual incidents, but the drawings do not show any of these people as victims. What they're doing is very normal. They're singing, they're dancing, they're wearing a hoodie, they're, shopping. And I think that's the power. That is this combination of what you've put together here. That is the real power, because you're right. If people want to protect themselves from seeing harmful images, your book is a great place to turn to, because the images are so astounding. what you do with facial expressions and things, I just can't get over it looking through this book. It's amazing.
I appreciate that, Pam. It was really important for me. I thought at first, let me say it this way, I thought about doing portraits of the people who have been harassed or killed by police. And there's been some beautiful art depicting George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, other Black people, the way that those bear witness to reshape how we remember those people. We remember them as alive people who were worthy of being remembered. I think that's critically important work. But I always keep in mind, and I'm going to paraphrase the African-American writer Zora Neale Hurston. She was back in the she, I think, died in the 1960s, did amazing work ahead of her time in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And, when Black people were called colored people. And she said that she refused to be tragically colored. And this was at a time when lynchings were not infrequent, and segregation, Jim Crow segregation, was pervasive throughout the South, and a de facto segregation existed in the rest of the country. And yet all she could see when she looked at Black people was their beauty, their power, this wonderful, innovative culture to which everyone wanted access, even at that time. And so I wanted instead, there's some amazing artists out there, and I thought I will leave to those incredible artists the work of commemorating people through portraiture. I will try to create a portrait of the community that is left in the wake of these incidents, and that, despite that, continues to keep on keeping on. I think it's such a powerful thing that Black people have done for at least since emancipation, and that is the notion of, loving Blackness, loving each other. And, certainly the 1960s with Black Power and Black is Beautiful was really important, but Black is Beautiful also was a big part of the ethos of the 1920s, before that with Marcus Garvey, and you even see some people espousing similar ideas, at least in their literature, in the 1800s. And so I wanted to create a lens, I wanted to create a way for people to see Black people the way I do. And also, hopefully, call attention to the gap between what I see when I look at Black people, say, voting, and what other people see when they look at Black people voting, and figure out a way to close that gap. I see someone, when I see an old Black person voting, person who I know was born and was an adult before the Voting Rights Act, that to me is such a powerful, amazing thing to see. My own great-grandmother, both of my great-grandmothers were born. One was born at least in the 1880s. And when I think about the fact that she was an adult woman in the early 20th century and couldn't vote until the 1960s, there's such a powerful, wonderful thing with these, and I see women who get all dressed up to go to the polls. I'm like, of course you do, because even if you were a child before the Voting Rights Act, your mother couldn't vote until then. And so this is special. Thinking while Black people have been arrested for thinking. They've had the police called on them for thinking. I see Black folks doing stuff, and just, I love Black people unconditionally. In all of our diversity, I just see such power and something that's so special. And there's a huge divide between my perception and others. And so, the juxtaposition in the book of an illustration on one page and a definition on the other. In some ways, the illustration represents my perspective, and the definition represents the perspective of all of those people and institutions who see this thing that I portray as a crime.
I love that you talk about the goal of closing this gap, because I think that is the power of your work, really. And I'm just so glad that you made this book, because it's so easy to have your morning outrage when you read the paper if you're not directly affected by it. And then the next day you're outraged by something else. And it just goes on, and it becomes just a staple of how you live your life if it's not affecting you. And putting all these incidents together, but also putting these beautiful, joyful, vibrant portraits in there is just the most powerful way to work with this that I have seen.
It's so interesting to create a book like this because I created the book and now it's out in the world and I'm learning what the book means to other people. And it's been really wonderful. It hasn't been out for that long, just since late November. And so it's really great to get people's reactions. And, people are experiencing the book in ways that I hadn't anticipated. I don't know what I anticipated. The more I think about it, the more I hope that there will be some concrete actions that people want to take after looking at the book. Because I don't believe that most people want to participate in the criminalization of everyday activities by Black people. And yet, how does one prevent that? Knowing that all of these things happen, what do you do next? And, I think it's going to be different for different people. One of the things I think that is important is, bearing witness. If you see one of these incidents ratcheting up, be a voice of intervention and say, this is not okay. This person is welcome here. I think making sure that everyone knows that the standard is whether you're comfortable with someone's presence or not, that person is welcome, that person belongs. And what are some concrete steps that your community can do to make sure that Black people know that they're welcome there? I think about a store like Bergdorf Goodman's in New York, or Barney's. Barney's has been, what could Barney's have done?
They were in there a couple of times.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Barney's is kind of part of the rogues gallery of how not to be a retail outlet. What could other department stores do to make sure that Black people feel welcome and not suspect? What do you need to tell your security people? And frankly, changing your advertising, changing the way that you use mannequins, signs inside to make sure that you're going to normalize Black shoppers. And there's so much that can be done that's simple, not expensive. In the case of individual people, if you see an African-American person shopping in your grocery store and you never see Black people in that store, making eye contact and just saying hello. Doesn't have to be, I'm so glad you're here as a Black person shopping here. Just eye contact, hello, and keep doing what you're doing. Those kinds of things can make a difference.
Well, Ajuan, I'm sure we will talk about this further over the next few weeks and months, but can you end by telling people where they can get this book?
Oh, yes. Living While Black is available at many bookstores. If you go to your local bookstore and it's not there, ask for it. Of course, it's available at the online booksellers, large and small. And I'm happy to say that if you're in the Bay Area and you go to the Berkeley Film Archive and the Berkeley Art Museum, that museum store also carries Living While Black.
And where can people find out just more about you and your other work in general?
Oh, you can look me up, ajuanmance.com. It also has links to my social media accounts where I post work pretty regularly. Follow me, say hello, and check out my portfolio, which is available on my website.
This book is really incredible work. Thank you so much, Ajuan, for being on the show again to talk about it.
Thanks, Pam.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Ajuan Mance for sharing her motivation and inspiration and process behind her new book, Living While Black, Portraits of Everyday Resistance. I really appreciated her calls to action. You can find out more about Ajuan's work at ajuanmance.com. I'll also include more links in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening. Are you already familiar with Ajuan's work? I'd love to hear from you. What are your favorites among her drawings and writings? As always, give us a follow and share us with someone who you think might be interested in the artists we talk to. And if you feel so inclined, a 5-star rating or positive review helps us to bring you more artists to share their work. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Quetzal and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. As always, this show was recorded using Squadcast FM. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.